Dr. Riana Elyse Anderson is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. She earned her PhD in clinical and community psychology at the University of Virginia and completed a clinical and community psychology residency at Yale University's School of Medicine, followed by a fellowship in applied psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She uses mixed methods in clinical interventions to study racial discrimination and socialization in Black families to reduce racial stress and trauma and improve psychological well-being and family functioning. She's interested in how these factors predict familial functioning and child psychosocial well-being and health-related behaviors when enrolled in family-based interventions. Dr. Anderson is the developer and director of Embrace Intervention, stands for Engaging, Managing, and Bonding Through Race, and loves to translate her work for a variety of audiences, particularly those whom she serves in the community via blogs, video, and literary articles. Dr. Anderson's work has garnered thousands of dollars in grants and has been supported by the Ford Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, National Institute of Health, Society for Research in Child Development, and Michigan Health Endowment Foundation. She also just recently submitted an R01, so fingers crossed for that one. Yes, gotta give a shout out. She has published over 30 peer-reviewed articles and contributed to a range of blogs, articles, and media, including features in the New York Times, the Times London, Huffington Post, Psychology Today, Women's Health, WebMD, and NBC's Newsroom. Dr. Anderson is involved nationally as an appointed member of the American Psychological Association's Children, Youth, and Families Committee and the Society for Research on Adolescence Anti-Racism Task Force. Dr. Anderson also serves as the co-host of Our Mental Health Minute, a vlog and podcast geared towards reducing stigma in the Black community. Finally, Dr. Anderson was born in, raised for, and returned to Detroit, Michigan. So without further ado, we'll give her a round of applause. And welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Let me make sure that I can share my screen. I can, fantastic. All right, it is such a pleasure being here today. I was telling Dr. Penn at the beginning that UNC is the home of so many of my mentors and colleagues. Rachel just mentioned Our Mental Health Minute, which had a graduate of your program, Sean Jones, who's my co-host, and he was mentored by Enrique Neblett, who is now my colleague at Michigan, but who served as a mentor of me as well. Plenty of people at UNC have paved the way, including Dr. Cooper, who's also on this call. So just incredibly grateful for the family that we have here today. I'm going to encourage you all to put your questions and comments in the chat. It's typically a very interactive presentation today because we have a shortened amount of time. I don't want to veer too much, and I know Zoom can get a little sticky with getting folks to participate, but I'm going to encourage you to put your questions in the chat because at the end I will absolutely be able to comb through if you don't want to ask them out loud. So it's interactive, give me some reactions, give me some chat action as I'm going along, but let's kick it off today. So I'm going to be talking to you all about preparing for racism like we do plane crashes, moving the talk to the walk. If you are on Twitter, feel free to tweet along at Riana Elyse and join me for the ride there. So our itinerary today, we're going to be taking off and understanding the lay of the skies and the land. If we're gonna ask the question, wheels up, now what? And where's my seatbelt? We're gonna adjust our masks. We're gonna ask a very fundamental question of, will the turbulence ever be over? We'll address safe landings, and if we have some time, we'll get into arrivals and baggage claim. Let's take off. In 2019, 257 people died in plane crashes worldwide. That same year, at least 260 Black people were killed by police in the US alone. So why do we know more about what to do in plane crashes than we would in racial incidents? If you want to understand the lay of the skies a bit, here is a wonderful figure that depicts the number of fatalities from airlines per year. And you see from the 40s to about the 80s, the airline industry was really trying to understand how to improve safety while they were also offering more flights per year. So at about 1980, they started figuring something out more, and you see that's where those lines start to precipitously drop so that in 2020, we're not losing many people at all due to these fatalities and these crashes. So you could say airplanes as structures are improving. And yet we engage in behaviors to keep us safe just in case. So for those of you that used to fly, I know that we don't fly that much anymore, but for those of you who used to fly, you are used to having instructions every single time you get on the plane. With discrimination, it's arguable whether the structure in the United States is improving. Some people surely believe that we're living a life that's better with respect to racial discrimination, and others, and there's been evidence this year even, that that is not the case. And yet we do not fully understand how to engage in behaviors to keep us emotionally safe in the case of racial discrimination, which I laid out the statistic before, that we're actually experiencing more of those cases. And that's with one type of discrimination. When we're thinking about the overuse of arms with some of our Black and brown stops with respect to stop and frisk, or with fatalities with police, we understand that those instances are happening so much more than things like plane crashes, and yet we're preparing so much more for the former. So when I'm talking about racial discrimination, what is it that I'm even addressing? I call it the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people on the grounds of race. The reason that this is important is because at least 90% of Black adults and youth as young as 8 report at least one incident of racism or racial discrimination per year. Now, we have recent data in some 2020 publications that indicate that some youth are reporting up to 5 incidents per day. So that's taking into account some of these online or vicarious discrimination experiences. But to go from 1 per year, which was already bad enough, to 5 per day, we can understand how important this phenomenon is. One of the ways that we get up to this number of 5 per day, or even once a year, is because discrimination types and experiences can differ. So I won't spend too long on this. I know that you have, again, a lot of knowledge about what this is, but you can see the different layers or pieces of fabric that go into what makes up racism. In psychology, we tend to focus more on some of those more interpersonal experiences, so what's going on between people, and that's where we get this idea of racial discrimination. But in other studies in other areas like public health, you might think of it more on the structural level, more of the institutional level, and that's when we might think of it as a system of racism rather than just individual experiences, like we might say for interpersonal racial discrimination. So again, within public health, there's sometimes a focus on this idea of life expectancy. So we'll talk about in this, and I'm going to go through this briefly, that there are ideas that people have about income driving a lot of these racial disparities that we might see in certain cities. So I'm going to show you an example of where I live in Detroit and on my way to the University of Michigan when, again, we got in cars and we went to work. So take a look at this map. So I live here where that yellow circle just highlighted, that I can look forward to 70 being the amount of years that I can grow old and serve my community. So I can be 70 living here in the 48207 zip code. Now, we're not even in Ann Arbor yet, but on my way to work, if I were a citizen that lived here in the 48168 zip code, then I might be looking forward to 85 years of serving and living fruitfully in my community. So that's the 15-year gap. And some people might say, well, where you are is based on your income as well. So there are lower income people within the city of Detroit. There are higher income folks on the way out to Ann Arbor. That's why you're seeing some of these disparities. And I say, okay, maybe that's true. And then I pop up this little map right here. Now you're gonna have to bear with me. I call this the tush and the leg. So if you can see that, we've got the legs starting here and then a nice posterior right there. So the tush and the legs indicate not just what I've made up in my mind to describe this graph, but it's looking at some disparities and differences within the city of Detroit. This blue represents white residents within the city, and this green represents Black residents. So if I were to go into a deep dive into Detroit, which I love to do, and I'm always happy to send information about that, you would understand what exactly this line represents. If you ever watched the movie 8 Mile, this is not 8 Mile, but we have a number of those types of barriers in Detroit, or boundaries that indicate the city proper from the suburbs. So that's the case here on the east side, that if I were driving along Jefferson Avenue and I hit Alter Road, this is where Black residents in the city of Detroit live and where our white suburban counterparts live. Now, when you overlay that on top of this map, you get a sense that even someone living on Alter Road, a Black resident who's getting maybe some resources from Detroit, but is also able to go into this adjoining city of Grosse Pointe, those residents on the left side of Alter Road are living an 11-year difference than their neighbors on the right side of the road. So even income disparities don't quite spell the picture here. We're seeing racial, and again, where green represents Black residents, where that blue represents white, you're seeing that stark divide based on policy, based on a history of racial division within the city of Detroit. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about some of those more systemic elements. We're going to bring it back to interpersonal. So in racial discrimination in particular, when we're thinking about children, right? So we just talked about life expectancy, that's getting toward the other end of age. But when we bring it back to children, I'm shocked every time I look at this to see what discrimination is associated with. So beyond just life expectancy, when we're talking about some of the small independent items that Black youth are facing, these are some of those psychosocial, some of the health-related indicators that we find that are related to racial discrimination. Any one of them would be a shame. All 20 of these are uncalled for when we know what the predictor is and we know what the problem is, and it's racial discrimination. I'm going to zoom in today on what stress and trauma looks like with respect to racial discrimination. So racial stress and trauma in particular, we're thinking about it as symptoms as a consequence of emotional pain during and or after discrimination. So it can be chronic or acute. It can be temporal as well, something that takes time to pop up. That stress from discrimination has been linked to adult and youth outcomes. So some people forget about the children here, but with children, we see academic and cognitive impairment, psychological impairment, and physiological impairment as well. If you don't know what racial stress and trauma looks like, I offer this opportunity. And again, this is something that I'm going to ask you in the chat to reflect on. So you're going to be watching AJ describe for you what stress and trauma looks like for him from a racial perspective. And I want you to think about what it is that you see, hear, and feel. So as you're watching, keep those things in mind. What you see, what you hear, and what you feel. And as you see something, hear something, or feel something from AJ, go ahead and drop that in the chat.
So what are the problems that we're facing today?
Oh, racism. Cops killing Black people. Just like, mostly about like racist. Like, cops is killing Black people, and the cops that kill Black people is white. You ever notice that?
So what do you think that means? Like, expand on that for me. Talk to me about that.
So what do I mean about that? Like, the Black people don't like, the white people don't like the Black people. So like the cops is like trying to get rid of the Black people faster so they can live longer, but they just trying to get rid of them.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know.
How does it feel when you see things like that?
It hurts.
Okay, so again, if you feel up to it, put in the chat what it is that you saw, what it is that you heard, and what it is that you felt. And I see that some folks are starting to enter in some things, so please keep it going. I'm going to indicate what it is that we typically hear about AJ and why I don't share things like his age at the beginning. Some people think that AJ is speaking very matter-of-factly. Some people think that he has an idea of what it is that he's talking about. Some people see that he's coming to a realization, that he's having an aha moment in front of us. Some people see the food that he's eating. So this is in Philly, that will be a water ice. And yes, it's a slushy, but we won't get into it today. So he's eating a red water ice, and he's soothing himself, right, with some sweet and caloric stuff like we do when we are feeling stressed out. Some of the things that we even saw on the last slide, right, about what discrimination can predict. So he is soothing himself through food. He is trying to get to understand what it is that's around him, all while he's describing systemic racism, right? So he's trying to do this yeoman's task of describing something that is and was, and unfortunately will be, if we're not able to figure this out appropriately, but he's describing this yeoman's task of what is in front of him, what's around him, what has taken the life of people like George Floyd 3 years after he even made this type of comment. And it's coming to him as a 10-year-old boy in a classroom setting. So this very developmentally normative looking situation. He's in a classroom setting, he's eating a sweet treat, he is talking to us about things that bother him, but the thing that he's talking about is so big and so consuming that we're watching him really struggle and give words to something that's much bigger than him. So he's describing what racial stress and trauma is for him, and he concludes with, it hurts. So that's why we focus on people like AJ and young people like him, because it hurts to experience what it is around him.
So what are the problems?
One thing that AJ talked about was this idea of compromised coping. When we're asking, you know, what is it that you do about it? Some of it we didn't show on the screen, but something that comes up after this clip, when we ask, what is it that he does? Who does he consult about this? He said, well, nobody really, it's on the TV. These are the things that I'm getting. These are the things that are coming at me. So he doesn't quite know what to do with that hurt or that challenge that he's facing. What we do know about what racial discrimination does is that it impairs normal coping processes. So it's in two ways, where African Americans use more avoidant coping only when faced with racially discriminatory events. One way, within self. So I might use more avoidant coping relative to my own self. I might typically use approach-oriented coping for other types of stressors, but within myself, I might use more avoidant with racial discrimination. And then it's also relative to other people. So in one situation, if I show you a racially discriminatory event, African Americans tend to use more avoidant coping for that particular event relative to folks of other groups. So there's something in the socialization of what we've been telling and showing Black people in these events. And like what AJ was describing, he doesn't quite know what to do when there are police officers in his neighborhood that are doing this thing, when there are police officers on TV doing this thing. What do you even do with that? How would you even approach such a large issue like that? So we're watching AJ at 10 really trying to understand what can I even do about something that's so large and so looming. In that way, if we're taking out some of the approach-oriented coping strategies, then we know that there's not going to be as much of availability of what to do. So maybe you're taking out half of your normal coping processes if you're only going this avoidant-oriented route. So what parents tend to do in this way is help socialize their children around coping with what to do with these racial events in particular, which requires additional skill sets and efforts. So one of our papers showed there's an additional variance that's explained when parents are trying to explain what to do in racial situations versus all of these other types of stressors that may come in a child or adolescent's life. So when these parents are seeing these types of headlines, and there are so many more new ones, I gotta update the slide, but so many more news stories, unfortunately, of when parents are cued or triggered to say, now we have started, now we have to start utilizing these coping strategies to get ready for what it is that's going on. I saw a note that my internet was unstable, so I'm not quite sure if you missed anything, but essentially the wheels are up. We're starting to go into turbulent air and sky. Now we need to utilize a coping strategy that's going to work with the racial stress and trauma that you might be experiencing as a child. So now we got to search for something. Where's my seatbelt, right? So we would call this in this way, the way to keep safe, the way to keep calm in these turbulent skies, maybe our seatbelt. This is racial socialization. which is communication between family members about the racial world as a means to better cope with this racially discriminatory event. So there are 4 strategies that family members typically use, and I'm going to let my colleague from UNC and I explain it a little bit better in this very corny video.
This session is dedicated to the youth who have been killed by discriminatory practices, including
Laquan McDonald,
Tamir Rice,
Ayanna Stanley Jones,
Michael Brown.
Trayvon Martin.
Oh man,
Reed, what's got you worked up today?
man, it's another one of these headlines talking about a young kid killed by a police officer or a dang on vigilante.
Man, I don't know what it would have been like to have race all in our face like that growing up.
You mean like the O.J. Simpson trial or the L.A. riots or Rodney King?
Snap, man. I didn't even think about the fact that young kids can pick up on race like that.
Yeah, I mean by 3, kids are starting to see differences in the race. By 7, they're making meaning of those differences. And by 10, they're starting to think about their own role in that difference.
If only there were a way for parents and children to talk about race effectively.
But there is. So racial socialization is all about the way that parents teach kids about the racial world around them.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure I follow. What do you mean by the whole socialization thing?
Yeah, well, you know how we tell kids to look both ways before they cross the street or not to talk to strangers, right? So racial socialization is about race specifically. I bet you can even think about a few things that your family's told you about what to do when you were growing up. Think about cultural socialization or pride.
You mean like celebrating Kwanzaa or going to the African American Museum or singing songs like, "Say it loud, woo, I'm black and I'm proud."
Yep, that's it. How about preparation for bias?
You know what? Every time I get in the car, I can hear my mom's advice telling me where to put my hands if I ever get pulled over. 10 and 2.
And yet we've seen plenty of evidence that shows even when we follow these rules in every situation, it doesn't work every time.
Yeah, so what about like when people get upset when things do actually happen?
Well, that's also a type of a socialization, right? So we call that promotion of distrust. It's when stuff happens and we want to pass that distrust down to our kids.
I've heard some people go in the opposite direction. I mean, talking about the fact that race doesn't even matter at all anymore.
Yeah, well, that's our last category, right? So some people call it post-racial, some people call it egalitarianism, but it's all about being equal despite race.
Great. I mean, that's a ton of strategies. I mean, so which one should we choose?
Yeah, well, the good thing is you don't have to choose just one. Most parents do a blended approach, but it's about the type of blend that makes sense. So preparation for bias and pride messages together typically yield better psychological, academic, and identity outcomes for youth.
So what should we be telling youth who need to know about the world around them?
Well, the good thing is we should be talking to youth, right? So kids are totally observant. They're seeing these headlines. They're not missing it. So we need to be talking to our kids first and foremost. And we need to be providing them, again, with those blended messages, pride and preparation, messages and activities, so that we can let our kids know that being Black is a beautiful thing, even when other people don't think so. I'm Ree.
And I'm CT.
And this is our Mental Health Minute.
You are young,
I knew it was going to do that. All right, 1 second. There we go. Okay, so that hopefully gave you a very corny, quick idea of what racial socialization is. It's traditionally measured by content and frequency. So the 4 areas that we've already talked about and how frequently family members do that. Some of the findings from those studies of the past 40 years have been mixed, and it's because certain types are often associated with more positive outcomes, like the 2 that we mentioned first, cultural socialization and preparation for bias. But sometimes there's discrepancy in transmission of content and frequency between reporters. So if you're thinking about how many times a parent has to remind the kids to buckle up for safety, whether that's on a plane or in a car, you can understand that some people think that they're saying it more, some people are receiving it a little bit less. So sometimes you're getting those messages that are going to be associated with things that are more positive, whereas some of the other ones aren't as positive. So it may not just be a frequency issue there. And we're also thinking about how do we get on the same page with respect to what's being reported. So briefly, I'm just going to tell you a bit about how we think about adjusting our masks and a new way of conceptualizing what racial socialization is. So we're thinking about how we assess the quality of these processes, which is really consistent with the parent-child intervention literature, where we're thinking about it as make sure your mask is securely on not just on, not just how many times you're putting the mask on. And that's really apropos for today's world, right? So if we're wearing our masks as a chin strap, as we might call it, or we see folks adorning their beards with the masks, that's not how we need to appropriately wear them. But if we're putting it over our nose and our mouth in an appropriate way so that it's securely on, that may be what it is that we need to be measuring more. The way that we think about competency then is through 3 different strategies. So again, briefly, we think about it about reducing stress. So what's the burden and import of preparing children to successfully cope with a racialized society? We think about it improving skills, the degree to which a socializing agent understands and is prepared through repeated exercise to engage in racial socialization with a child, and improving confidence. So the ability that a socializing agent feels regarding communication with the child. So those 3 components make up racial socialization competency. We described that competency within a theory that was published last year in the American Psychologist with my postdoc mentor, Howard Stevenson, called the Racial Encounter Coping Appraisal and Socialization Theory. So briefly, what it is that we try to do within this theory is show the racialized stressors that are predictors of these later challenges of psychosocial and coping related outcomes. So this is your very classic transactional model of stress and coping here. You've got a stressor, what it is that you're going to do with that, helps to predict some of the outcomes that you have psychologically, physiologically, etc. What we argue, though, is that these racialized components that mediate this relationship are less explained and described by a traditional model because of what, again, we've already talked about, what racial discrimination does to our coping processes, the frequency with which racial discrimination the frequency with which our children face racial discrimination, and the ways in which racial socialization uniquely explains some of that variance and has to be used within these Black families to control for some of these predictor and outcome trajectories that we see at the bottom. So we know that the addition of racialized components is unique and requires a specific theory to describe what the relationships are between all of these variables. So we offer recast as a way to think about what racial encounters do, how we need to cope and appraise with it specifically, and how racial socialization plays a role in this relationship that we see here. So what's missing at this point? We know that the problem is racial discrimination and racism. We've got a theory that I just very quickly went through. So why won't someone do something about it is the question that I had when I was studying this. So that's me. I'm here, and I do have something to say about it and something to do with it. So I'm going to tell you a bit about Embrace, Engaging, Managing, and Bonding Through Race. We have a lab, and I want to tell you about some of the projects that we're working on this year to do something about this problem. So we'll start with assessment, we'll move into application, and end with advancement. So based on this recast model, we're testing the associations below that we just talked about with a sample of 361 Black caregivers. So we're doing that through measuring what racial socialization competency even is. We're looking at some of the pathways that we're describing. Does racial discrimination lead to racial stress? And does racial competency then help to address some of those other factors that come up later? And indeed, when we put this whole model together, do these associations persist? Do we actually see what it is that we theorize and predict? So briefly, our first paper where we validated the 28-item racial socialization competency scale is up and running. So now we can ask parents about the confidence, the stress, and the skills that they have when they're engaging in racial socialization. It has teeth. We found some validity to it. For paper 2, what we're trying to do is think about a latent class analysis, which groups the types of competency that parents have and measures it with other parental characteristics. So a long story short about that is, if we're doing an intervention and we know that parents come in with a certain level of socioeconomic status or education, are they more likely to feel stressed? Are they more likely to feel confident? If we already know some of the predictor characteristics about parents, can we work in an intervention to actually help to target specific type of competencies? That's what we were trying to do in paper 2, and that paper is under review at this time. In our third paper, that's where we're taking the entire model and we're seeing if it actually has teeth. So it's a structure and equation model, which assesses racial worries as a mediator of discrimination and child psychological wellness with competency as a moderator. So essentially, do parents worry about what it is that their children are going to face in the real world? And if we can have more competent parents, does that essentially explain that, or does it help to modulate the association between that worry and some of those kid outcomes? So we found that in fact it does. If we have parents who are more competent, who feel more skillful, less stressed, and more confident, that these are parents who have children with better psychological outcomes. So again, from an intervention standpoint, if we can beef up that competence perspective, we feel that we can remove some of the sting of racial discrimination from Black youth's outcomes. All right, so to the application part, my favorite part. We're looking at Embrace. What is Embrace? So Embrace is a 5-session family-based intervention, which is designed to increase parent and adolescent socialization competency, reduce parent and adolescent racial stress and trauma through self-efficacy and coping. If you think that you can do a better job addressing this, then you might be able to apply some of what it is that you've thought about to this actual problem that you have. So we practice some of the skills that one would have, some of the thoughts and the skills to actually address this problem. And then we eventually hope that it improves some of those adolescent outcomes that we talked about. So certainly psychological, some academic, some physiological, etc. We have skill development within the intervention of engaging in this racial socialization content. So can you even talk about the racial stuff in the world, about how to manage the stress through some strategies like CLCVE, and if we have time, I'm happy to talk about what the heck that is. And then bonding. So how do you have a family delivery with something that's really challenging, that's still positive and still affirming, and again, in a world that's really quite negative about this specific issue of racial discrimination. So as the first racial socialization intervention for adolescents and parents, Embrace seeks to provide support for culturally specific theories like recast and evidence-based practices in the confrontation and resolution of discriminatory events. If you say it another way, we're moving the talk to the walk. So I always shout out the Migos and Drake here for just demonstrating how you walk it like we talk it. So that's what we're doing there. So Embrace utilizes the recast theory. It takes those same structures that we saw before and targets some of the areas through our 5 sessions. So in the first block of those predictors, we try to increase the awareness of the stressor. So how do you even appraise what it is that you're experiencing? And how do we improve the stress management that is coming from the racial stress experienced from that discrimination? For those racialized components, we want to reinforce those protective racial socialization strategies. So when we talked about cultural socialization or preparation for bias, how do we reinforce those strategies while also getting parents to think about some of the harm that comes from some of the other strategies that are that they may be using, right? We want to improve that parent-child relationship, improve racial socialization competence, and advance self-efficacy. So what children think they can do about this issue, we want to make sure that we're advancing that thought, because that thought then leads to what they actually do with respect to coping. So we want them to be assertive with some of their approach-oriented coping strategies. We want to expand their ability to do more things to address the problem. And that self-efficacy tapped onto that coping as a result of parents' competency helps children to reach better psychosocial outcomes. That is our theory, and that's what we're trying to demonstrate through the Embrace intervention. So what we've done in the past through a pilot in Philadelphia is recruited Black 10 to 14-year-olds and their caregivers. So we compensate the families $100 and plus a bonus if they're able to attend sessions in succession for a completed trial. We provide books, t-shirts, gift certificates, and participation certificates. In our Philly trial, we recruited from schools with behavioral service agencies who are our partners, and through social media, word of mouth, and community flyering. We've developed a clinical manual and participant guide, so 135 standardized pages of what clinicians are going to be using with the family. And this is content and activity that's geared toward the parent individually, the child individually, and the family. And we roll that out with 30-minute parallel sessions, which means that we see the parent independently and the child independently. We bring them together for a 15-minute dinner or snack, and then the remaining session is a 45-minute conjoint time for them to discuss what it was that they were describing and in their independent sessions. So that question that we asked earlier in the, when we rolled out what we were going to do today, will this turbulence ever be over? So let's take a look at what we found in our Philly pilot. So I'm going to ask your attention to this figure to the right, just so I can explain it a bit better. So we're looking at what happened with parents' coping ability. So on our y-axis, we're taking a look at perception of coping ability from very low to very high. So 5 represents a very high ability to cope with that stressor that was in front of them. And again, this is racial discrimination in particular. On our x-axis, we see the session number. So again, embraces 5 sessions. So from the very first session to the last is what we're looking at here. And then the colored different lines represent different types of coping strategies. So I referenced CLCBE, that stands for calculate, locate, communicate, and then breathe and exhale, or relaxation strategies. So that's how well can you get a sense of how stressed out you are, where in your body is it, how well can you communicate that to someone else, and can you relax in the midst of this challenge? So again, CLCBE are some of the coping strategies that we use throughout the intervention. So what I want to show you here is that most people started at about a 4 with respect to how well can you cope with the stress that's in your life in these racialized stressors. What we predicted in session 2 and what we saw is that we were going to get a drop off for a lot of these different coping strategies once we're exposing people to what the stressor is. So in traditional stress and coping fashion, we saw that once you stress someone out, they actually are impacted by it and they don't think that they can cope as well. So that's what we see in session 2. And as a highlight, particular with this ability to breathe and exhale. And I actually spent a lot of time this summer when we saw the breath snuffed out of someone on national television. I spent a lot of time talking about beyond the rhetorical. This is not a metaphorical, we can't breathe. This is a very literal, we can't breathe. When you watch people who are stressed out from racism and how they grab their chest or how they have shallow breaths, they can't actually take in air. And we're actually seeing that demonstrated in that dot for session 2 here. So the session 2 dip was predicted and we actually saw it. But in stress and coping fashion, we actually saw that not only do those scores go back to what they were for session 3 in the same way that they were in session 1, so they returned to baseline, they actually went above and beyond in sessions 4 and 5. So this idea that I want to avoid racial stress so that I can feel better and not feel super stressed out wasn't supported if you continue to work with families on this stress and coping in a racialized fashion. The more time we spent with the stressor, the better families thought that they could cope with it. So that's what we saw quantitatively with our sample. Qualitatively, I'll choose one each here just so we can get some questions in. With respect to is Embrace useful with engaging, a youth indicated it felt good because like we can talk about like what we've seen, so like we won't have anger built up inside of us. So when we're thinking about internalizing, when we're thinking about externalizing problems, you're seeing youth picking up directly on those things that are impacting me on the inside. And some of our youth have indicated that they have anger, but it's built up inside, so they don't even know how to externalize that. So we have youth talking about some of those psychosocial outcomes that they face. With respect to managing, a parent noted it was empowering. It opens up like obviously a different conversation that you wouldn't typically have with your child. So for me, it was empowering because I feel like I'm teaching him like, you know, this is going to happen, but this is how you react. So again, this very clear stress and coping. How do we actually do something with the stress that's happening in our bodies and in our world? And finally, with bonding, a parent indicated, prior to Embrace, I thought I was well informed about how my child thought about certain situations. Since Embrace, I now listen more and encourage more communication from my child. So even in a really stressful situation, parents and children are able to maintain their relationship and get through this very challenging talk. I always love to show our folks too. So here is Ben describing his experience with Embrace.
Embrace helped me open up about some racial situations that actually happened to me, and it served as a support group for what I was thinking. It helped me think through what I was thinking. And it also served as a catalyst for conversations strictly about race instead of having race as the subtext of a conversation.
And here's Ben's mom, B.E.
Embrace helped me get to know him better and also be more open to listening instead of being in mommy mode all the time. You do this, you do that. I was challenged developing the words to have conversations about safety with law enforcement and confronting bias in the classroom. And it also helped in conversations we have here at home about our history, ancestral history, personal histories, and when talking about his future.
Love those folks. So we have a case study on them if you actually want to get to know more about what it is that they said in their own words. All right, now I want to quickly go, I'm sorry, that was a slide that should have been deleted. So I want to go very quickly into advancement. This is the coolest thing to me on the face of the planet, so we have to toot our horns on this. So based on Recast and Embrace, we're testing a new virtual reality platform called Passage Home that an MIT doc student is working on to see the behaviors influenced by the intervention. So it's one thing when you're writing on paper what it is that you believe that you can do with coping. It's one thing to tell our cameras what it is that Embrace did, but it's another to be in the moment for a discriminatory event and actually showing us through your eye movement or through your pulse what it is that you're experiencing as you're in this racially discriminatory event. So what you're going to witness for a brief moment is our classroom simulation of Passage Home, but we just got a grant this summer that's going to let us co-construct a police narrative with Detroit youth. So especially with what it was that we saw on TV and with what AJ has been describing, what we just heard from Ben and BE, law enforcement is something that is on our children's minds. So we want to co-construct what that narrative would look like with them. So I just want to give you a very brief look at Passage Home in the classroom setting here. Now, kind of narrowly on top, you're watching the user sitting in their seat and looking at this classroom in front of them. You'll see the point that's looking around, but in front of them, their classmates are not the see that there's a classmate speaker actually now you realize you're the only person left, and you are the person that's talking about this, and as the story goes on, that you turn out like you are and then you start to see some of the behaviors that you might want to select, how it is that you're feeling. So it's a really cool program and activity. Happy to talk more about that, but you're getting the real world experience. You're being told what's happening and you're reacting in real time to what it is that's going on. So that's our advancement through VR. Trying to get out of that. Okay, I think I skipped over something. So just for time, I want to hear your voices, so I'm going to kind of scoot through these last few slides. But just to let you know, this is from a professional development standpoint. Some people don't think that they can publish on some of these issues. They don't think that they can get grants as a result. I'm here to tell you that if it's your passion, if it's what you want to talk about, you can absolutely do it. So we have a number of publications, including theory, including measurement, including intervention, that demonstrate that these are publishable areas. We've had over $350,000 of funding, and we have 3 major grants submitted this year that we're hoping to bring some big money home. So just to let you know, you can get funded, and we can do it in myriad ways. So we did it in Philly, we did it in LA, and now our next stop is Detroit with our community partners. I just want to indicate that we're changing the narrative through 2 prongs. So we are working directly with families, which is where my passion is as a clinical psychologist, but we also have to be very honest as clinical folk, as people serving in the community, that we need to be trained better. We need to have better knowledge on what this is. So we have a whole intervention strategy for the families, but what we learned in our pilot was just how much the clinicians were impacted as well with their own bias, with their own ability to serve these families. So we're also hoping to go the provision route as well. The goal of all of this is that we want to cope with and tackle, or drop kick, which is a new term that I'm kind of coming up with on what we're doing. We're actually drop kicking racial discrimination to reduce and one day eliminate discrimination as a social determinant of health. So to finalize this, in our arrivals, we know that plane travel is becoming safer every year, that innovation allows planes to be more stable. And yet we prepare constantly for the harm from such a crash. Although no magic formula exists from preventing plane nor discriminatory fatalities or harm, we must prepare for it. Racial socialization allows for this preparation, and the major key is that it keeps children emotionally safe while helping them to build better planes, runways, and airports. A lot of people ask me, why don't we go toward racial discrimination? Trust me, I am, but we're also bringing the kids to like a healthier sense of self. We're essentially, what we like to think about it is as the Black Panther suit, where we're creating a barrier between what's being thrown at these children and their spirit, their psychosocial wellness, so that they feel well enough to contend with what it is that's going on. Those youth who were in the streets this summer, marching, chanting, fighting back, they were, not to say impervious, but they were just taking what was being thrown at them and throwing it back. So if we're able to create a barrier like an intervention like Embrace that helps them not only to become more aware of what it is that's going on around them, but how to contend with that, what it is that they want to do with that, with support from their family, with support from psychologists. This can be a really important opportunity for them to build up that armor, to build the better planes, runways, and airports. And again, we're not taking the blame off the faulty structure, which is indeed the society. I'm not going to miss that. Rather, focusing first on the life and the quality of that life for those children. It takes a structural and interpersonal approach to keep Black kids safe. So let's get our seatbelts and our masks ready. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm super excited to talk with you for these last few minutes. That means that you all can ask questions if you didn't know.
I think Dr. Sheridan had a question or questions in the chat. So Margaret, did you want to take it away?
Only if you don't pretend that you call me Dr. Sheridan ever, David.
I'm just practicing good professional skills. So
Okay.
That's it. No more.
Yeah, let's not be silly. Sure. I think maybe I think you actually addressed my first question in the course of your talk. But I guess I'm going to ask it anyway. So, because I work with really little kids, so 4 to 7 year olds, and I've done a little bit of work, and I know there's like a lot of work out there about the impact of media on mental health symptoms in kids. And I've just been thinking about that a lot this summer, and it feels like having gone through a program like Embrace or having parents who are good at racial socialization would sort of help you like create that armor. But I'm also just kind of wondering like how to conceptualize, I guess, like when you begin the process and how to begin the process with kids, and like how to balance this like massive exposure that Black kids are getting to police violence with like shaping their conceptualization of it. I just was sort of thinking about those two things in the same space, and I was wondering if you had thoughts about them.
Yeah, that was a question that came up quite a bit this summer as well. So I want to just acknowledge my postdoc mentor, Howard Stevenson, who's talked about this with the idea of racial literacy. So it's not that you would not hand children a text at all around this, but you're not going to hand them Shakespeare either. So you're not going to go to your kid with this idea that they need to understand systemic racism on X, Y, and Z level, but you're certainly not going to pretend that it doesn't exist either. So a lot of people try to shelter children and say, oh, well, they're not going to, know, or they're not going to understand this very early on, but they do. They get doses of it all the time. And we have even, the attentional research of 3-month-old, right? Like how long they're looking at something. We know that children are attending to and seeing these things very early on. So you figuring out how to find the right level of literacy for your child in the same way that we would do a pop-up book or, show pictures or to have a conversation that's at their level. The thing that I say to parents of all ages, though, is to ask the question, what is it that you see? Tell me what you notice. That is a age independent question to me of getting data from your child so that you can work with their baseline and say, this is how we can approach it together. So that would be my thought there, that yes, children are absolutely being inundated with these messages very early on of who they are, what's beautiful, what is expected of them, how long they're going to live, if they're even worth living. They're getting these messages constantly. So to wait until 10 with Embrace is absolutely not what I'm saying, but to find a literate approach for someone of their age is what I would encourage.
Thanks.
Rihanna, this is David. Firstly, thank you for the incredible presentation. I actually went ahead and texted Enrique during to tell him we were enjoying your talk, and it was so good to see Sean Jones there, even though I think Sean was a Dallas Cowboys fan, and I'm a Giants fan, so I always had some issues about that. But
it's Texas. I'm sorry, it's Texas.
It's Texas, right? But no, the bad feelings have passed. It's hard to be a Giant fan anyway these days. I had a question for you. You might have seen in the chat a kind of a naive question, which was, does Embrace get modified at all for boys versus girls, or are there different issues for boys versus girls in doing this sort of family treatment? I don't do family treatment, so maybe for all the people that do this is kind of a naive question. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's certainly not naive. It's something that our reviewers remind me of all the time, and I have to think about it all the time. Here's what I'll say. Does racial socialization differ for boys and girls? Yes. Does racial socialization differ with respect to which parent provides it? As Dr. Cooper can tell you, yes. So we know these things. Does discrimination differ for boys and girls? Yes. So those things don't, or maybe frequency or the type of experience, those things differ. I don't think that we're naive to those differences. What I would argue though for Embrace as an intervention is that what we have found thus far is that competence is a better explanation for some of these outcomes than any of those variables, including, interestingly, what we might find like depression being something that differs between boys and girls for an outcome. Socialization competency actually explains, like the strength of competency actually better explains child outcomes than even boy-girl status. So what we're saying is that if we can find and target the right thing, which we are hoping, through our studies to show that this is a stronger variable to target than any of these smaller individual characteristics, that the better, the more skills, the more confidence, the less stress we can exact within these racialized conversations, the better it is for children of all outcomes, the better it is for parents of all backgrounds. That would be our argument there.
Got it. Thank you.
I need a student. We have 3 minutes. I need to hear a student voice.
Yeah, I second it.
Well, I'm not a student, but I have a question. So David, you sort of answered my question in general around gender of parent, gender of child, gender of parent. But I would also ask for the students thinking about being a psychologist in a school of public health, and can you offer some insights into your experience in terms of how you're applying your clinical training in a public health format?
Sure. The long story short is like, I am who I am everywhere. So like you are going to get me like every time. So I was trained in the school of psychology. I had a fellowship in an ed school. Then I went to a school of medicine, then a school of ed again, and then social work, and now public health. Like I have been everywhere, and I'm the same OG like throughout it all. Like you're going to get me like the whole time. So it may be that I'm coming at it from a different theory, like maybe I'm pulling from different theoretical explanations to describe my work, or I'm using different terms, so social determinants of health versus risk and protective factors, right? So maybe there's a language that we have to code switch with, but like you're gonna get me being interested in the same thing. So I think if you're doing good work, and maybe this is naive for me, but if you're doing good work and you know what your work is about and you can use a language that helps people to understand it, then you can remain consistent across these fields and just demonstrate to them why it matters for their outcomes or for their processes. But it doesn't, I have to be honest, and I think I get in trouble a little bit in my school of public health with that, because I'm like, I'm a psychologist, and then I start my talk and it's just like, this is who I am. Y'all hired me, so maybe that's on y'all for making that mistake. Like, I don't know, but that's who I am. So that wasn't like the best answer for professional development, but there you go, Dr. Cooper. All right, now I need one more student for real. We have 1 minute. Go, students, come.
I have a question, Dr. Anderson, and actually we usually go to 1:15, so we have a little bit more time, thankfully.
Okay.
If that's okay.
I mean, I just have to apple pick, but whatever. Go ahead, Josh.
Okay, I'll ask quickly then. So my thoughts were around the implementation of the intervention itself, which sounds super cool, and I'd love to hear more about what those sessions looked like, what the challenges, if there were unexpected challenges or things that were unexpectedly easy, like in particular, like around, you mentioned the 4 different types of racial socialization, and like I'm thinking about being in the therapy room and wanting to validate the promotion of distrust or whatever views they come into the room with, how that, you get where I'm going with this, how that might get in the way of the ultimate goal of the intervention.
Yeah, so great question. And I actually typically have some ghost slides, but I don't know if it's in this slide deck. So to be super clear, and I don't think I was on that, so thank you for this. The 5 sessions have the 4 components that we talked about, those 4 constructs of racial social, for each of the first 4 sessions. So you will have a cultural socialization day, and we do that first because we know that children require a strong sense of identity before we introduce them to discrimination. So we don't want to come out the gate like, the world is challenging and it hates you. Like, we don't want to come out the gate with that, but we want to really ensure that they know who they are. So even songs like Young, Gifted, and Black, that's actually a song that we will put in Embrace so that kids can hear some of the great things that their culture and their identity provides. So that'll be session 1. Then the second session is prep for bias. The third session is promotion of dis or mistrust. The fourth is egalitarianism. So what we typically do is in those first 2 sessions, we try to beef up those protective elements that we know typically work better for youth. In that third session of promotion of distrust, this is a really great question, and I wonder if you're one of the reviewers that keeps asking about this, so if it's you, just let me know. But they're like, well, why on earth would you want to teach them about this? Like, if it's related to negative things, like, we don't understand why you would want to teach them. What Embrace tries to do is, for all of our sessions, it's not directive. We very much provide psychoeducation about what the literature says is related to these things, and we use a lot of Socratic questions around, well, if we know that these things are related, like, how might you want to use them? Or what are some of the changes you might want to use in your strategies? We'll beg the question given this type of information. So promotion of distrust, one of the examples that I can give, a parent was indicating that they experienced some discrimination on public transit in Philly, got very frustrated, and a police officer came to talk to them, and their children are now crying in front of them, seeing what it is that is going on. Now the parent is saying, well, you can't trust any of them, is actively doing distrust messaging in front of these kids, and the kids are anxious, crying. It's a whole scene. So we'll take that scene and we'll say, all right, if we replayed that, what would you have wanted to say? What would you have wanted to do differently? How can we have prevented that outcome of your children having so much stress, anxiety, and depression from seeing what it was that you were facing. Like, how can we actually navigate a different outcome for that experience? So it's not directive at all. We're not saying this is what you have to do. We don't have those answers in that way. That's just not how racism works, right? But we can help to process what it was that you felt when you had that experience, how you would want to do it differently. And given what we know about promotion of distress and how it relates to child outcomes, how would you want to navigate this moving forward? Those are the types of questions that we would ask for promotion of distress and egalitarianism in our 3rd and 4th sessions. And then in session 5 is where we do a lot of skill-based. We're not going to be with you after this, so how do you take this show on the road with your family? How do you beef up your expertise with all of these 4 different strategies? What else do you need to know? How else can we prepare you for the world outside of the embrace? So was that helpful, Joshua?
Very much so. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Hi, I have a question.
Hey.
In terms of these messages, we know that sometimes parents they think that they're giving off certain messaging, but the child doesn't internalize it in the same way, right, or they didn't receive the same message or the same words. And so I know you talk with parents like throughout the intervention and, you know, you're giving these tools, but I'm wondering, how do we know that moving after the intervention, that parents are still using that same language? Like, how do we know that, you know, when they're actually put in a situation after the intervention, that what they're saying actually maps on to what we want the child to kind of actually take from that conversation? I was wondering if you had thoughts about how you would make that, you know, a sustainable kind of check-in. Are there ways that they can revisit the material after the fact?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as you know, there are very few active racial socialization programs that exist. So the literature that we do have, even if it's longitudinal, takes a look at these 2 discrete, like, parents answer this, children answer this, and that's where you're seeing messages that are missing each other, you know, through and through. We not only have that separation in session, then we bring them together at the end. So that's one level of bringing it together. Then we have what we call fun work, which is homework that one of our participants named. They were like, this isn't homework, this is fun. So it's fun work, and we're like, done, easy. It's fun work. So we have fun work that supports what they just learned and a preview to what they're about to learn. So there are not only 5 sessions, there are 5 out of session opportunities for them to practice. So then we review what it was that they did that week. And one thing that I can just say from our experience, CLCBE, if I were to run through it very quickly, I would have you describe like a discriminatory experience that happened to you. Then I would ask, Marquita, on a scale of 1 to 10, like, how stressed are you? You would respond maybe 9. Okay, where are you feeling it in your body? My stomach. Okay, what would you want to say about it? I really don't like when people talk to me like that. Great. Now I need you to breathe and exhale. So we'll do that in session. Mm-hmm. My favorite thing on earth has been the number of people who come back and say, oh, Dr. Anderson, like, my mom was so upset this week in the grocery store and she did CLCBE, and let me tell you how it went. Like, they are telling you this is how the coping strategy worked in real life. And so do we have absolute certainty that they're going to utilize any of our strategies? Absolutely not. Do we think, based on the years of research that have gone into this, the theory now mapped on by the intervention, mapped on by our pilot, like, do we have proof of concept that we sent to the National Institute of Health yesterday so that they can fund me these $4 million to study this? Absolutely do. So, you know, I think we have a better shot with something like this than we have ever had before, because we haven't had a sustainable program that's been tailored to some of our families' needs in this way with racial social before. So I will tell you, as soon as we get this coin and I'm able to test it in Detroit and tell you, like, if we saw those long-term outcomes, but my belief is that we will.
Love that. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Just because I have donuts to get to does not mean that you can't ask a question.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, please. We have time for at least one more question if somebody wants to.
So I have just a question just about the current current context and even how we have been, thinking about how COVID is impacting how we reach families, how we make contact with families. And so have you thought about, moving forward currently, but also moving forward, thinking about this in a way that can be delivered more easily? Because I mean, in some ways it addresses the accessibility issue even beyond COVID. So what are your sort of tailoring of embrace for COVID-19 and beyond?
Oh, Shauna Cooper. Yes. So such a great question. I was very, very, very resistant at the start of COVID to make this an online platform, mainly because I know that online and computer-based modules have their entire science to it as well. So I didn't want to be someone who was just like, we got to throw it online just because. But then in May, when we lost George Floyd in such a visual and violent way, we had protests going beyond that. We have seen Dr. Jones and I, Sean Jones and I, have done some group-based work with Black youth and town halls. We're doing another one in a few weeks. I'm working with our community partners in this online way. Like, there's no question that the youth are in need of support. Right now, it's no question that parents are trying to ask, what do I say to my kids with all this on the TV, with all of us at home? There's so much stress coming from everywhere. So I give that backdrop because I'm entering into it very cautiously and with a knowledge that just putting something online may not be the best way of doing it. But if we are to put it online, we have to give care and thought to how it looks and how our families may receive it. And from an accessibility standpoint as well, if Black families don't have internet as much, if they don't have as many devices, like, who are we actually creating this for? Who is it being tailored to? That's another question. So our lab is thinking through that and many other questions as we speak, but our community partners have indicated wanting us to do an online launch in January if we can. So we're working very actively toward that goal. Again, I think the goal for me was always to make it an online format in years. So I wanted to get a chance to see, does Embrace work in a traditional trial and then up in a randomized control trial? And then as I work with people whose job it actually is to turn interventions into online platforms, like, how does that work and how can we get some of those evidence-based pieces into it? So that was always a goal, but I do think that we are being asked by our partners and just time is really requiring that we do something with it right now. So it's a great question, Shauna, and one that I hope over the next decade or so to really partner with people who know what they're doing in this domain so that our families are being served in the best way possible.
I had another question, and I'm going to ask it if it's okay. I was wondering if you see after, I was just interested about the sort of whether or not this, doing this skill-based work around parenting and Embrace has positive spillover to other kind of parenting measures, or what the relationship is, other kind of parenting stuff. I was kind of interested in whether or not you were shifting other things.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because our argument, the foundation of our argument is that a traditional parenting intervention would not have spillover in this capacity, right? So I can't say that that's not, what's a better way of saying what's in my head? We do think it'll work the other way. So we again, just from some of the qualitative statements that we had, we saw that parents and children were doing better with things like relationship. I'll say this from a anecdotal standpoint. It's this was the one day that I had to absolutely control my face and my body because I was about to break down in front of this family. The family started their session on two very different sides of the table, arms folded, just like an entire, we're not talking to each other, it's not looking good in this room. They started to describe what the issues were, which were baked in some racial and gender kind of instances that were happening in the school. So over the session, you see the arms come from unfolded and then the body kind of leans in more. And then by the end, the parent said as a Black girl, and it was just giving voice to it. And my eyes just started to, feel and crinkle. And then when they left, they're hugging, they're talking to each other, they're leaving out. And me and my co-facilitator just looked at each other it works, Embrace works. Oh my God, we were really tripping. So All that to say, yes, I do think that it will have spillover in other realms. I have stepped more away from some of those spaces, so it's not questions that are like readily something that I can answer, but if there is a collaborator that is really curious about that, I'm very open to it. Fantasy Lozada, for example, at VCU is thinking about some of those emotional socialization components that come in from observation. So we are going to be working together to answer some of those questions, but it's something that I've stepped back from. But anecdotally, we've seen it and it's been a beautiful thing. So.
Awesome. Well, maybe we can do another round of applause for Dr. Anderson. Thank you so much.
Thanks for all the DMs. I'm seeing them. I'm appreciating you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for presenting. As you can see, just an absolutely fantastic talk. And thank you for taking time, and especially since you just got out of the exhaustion of submitting an R01 grant. And I think you've given a lot of us stuff to think about. I know people in my lab were texting among each other just about following up with you at some point. So again, thank you so much for just a wonderful talk, and I hope you have a great rest of the weekend.
Thank you. I'll pick some apples and get some donuts for you all. But
Nice.
Have a wonderful Friday. Thank you all again for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a nice weekend.